Girl finds unconscious baby in park and takes her immediately to hospital. When the doctor examines the baby, she cries desperately at what she discovers. The late September breeze rustled through Riverside Park, scattering amber leaves across the worn footpath where 11-year-old Sophie Bennett walked alone. Her Saturday afternoon routine usually involved volunteering at the Millbrook Animal Shelter, but today they were closed for renovations. She kicked at the fallen leaves, her purple sneakers scuffed from countless similar walks, and adjusted the matching butterfly clips in her dark brown hair. Sophie loved this particular stretch of the park, where ancient oaks created a natural tunnel overhead and squirrels darted between the weathered wooden benches. The area was quieter than usual today. The approaching storm had driven most visitors home early. Dark clouds loomed above the tree canopy, and the wind carried the sharp scent of impending rain. Just one more lap, she whispered to herself, mimicking her mother's voice. Then straight home before the storm hits. That's when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself it was just the wind. But Sophie had spent enough time at the animal shelter to recognize distress, even in its quietest form. She stopped, holding her breath, and listened. There it was again, a weak whimper coming from behind the large rhododendron bush near the park's eastern fence. "Hello," Sophie called out, taking cautious steps toward the sound. "Is someone there?" The bush's thick leaves trembled in the strengthening wind, and Sophie noticed a small gap between its branches and the fence. Crouching down, she peered into the shadows. Her heart nearly stopped. A baby lay there, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket that had gone dirty gray around the edges. The infant's face was alarmingly still, lips tinged with a subtle blue that Sophie knew wasn't right. She'd seen enough medical shows with her mother, a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, to recognize when something was terribly wrong. Oh no, Sophie muttered, her hands shaking as she reached for the baby. The blanket was damp from the morning dew, and the infant felt cool to her touch. With great care, she lifted the baby, cradling it close to her chest just as she'd been taught to hold her cousin's newborn last Christmas. Sophie's mind raced. St. Mary's Hospital was only 2 blocks away. She could see its red brick tower rising above the trees. Should she call 911? No, that would take too long. The baby felt so light in her arms, so fragile. Each second seemed precious. "It's okay," she whispered to the infant, though her voice quavered. "I'm going to get you help. Just hold on." She ran. The journey to St. Mary's emergency department entrance felt like the longest 2 blocks of Sophie's life. Each footfall jarred through her body, and she tried to minimize the impact on the precious bundle in her arms. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a blast of warm air scented with antiseptic. "Help!" Sophie called out, her voice cracking. "Please, I found a baby. The baby needs help." The emergency room erupted into action. A nurse in blue scrubs rushed forward, already calling for assistance. Sophie found herself surrounded by medical staff, their voices overlapping in urgent but controlled tones. "Where did you find the infant? How long has the baby been unresponsive? What's your name, sweetheart?" Sophie answered their questions as best she could, her words tumbling out in a rush. Through the chaos, she noticed a woman in a white coat hurrying toward them. Dr. Sarah Chen's name badge caught the fluorescent light as she approached, her dark eyes quickly assessing the situation. "I'll take it from here," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that somehow calmed the chaos around them. She reached for the baby with practiced hands, and Sophie felt an inexplicable reluctance to let go. "You did the right thing bringing the baby here," the doctor added softly, noting Sophie's hesitation. "You may have saved this little one's life." As the medical team whisked the baby away through heavy double doors, Sophie stood rooted to the spot, her empty arms still curved as if holding the infant. A security guard approached, asking if she needed to call her parents. Sophie nodded numbly, suddenly aware of how her heart was pounding. While waiting for her mother to arrive, Sophie couldn't shake the image of Dr. Chen's face in that first moment she'd seen the baby. There had been something in the doctor's expression, a flicker of recognition or pain, that seemed deeper than professional concern. Sophie had always been good at reading people, It was what made her so effective with the scared animals at the shelter. And something told her that Dr. Chen's story was somehow entangled with the baby's fate in ways she couldn't yet understand. Through the emergency room windows, Sophie watched as the threatened storm finally broke, rain streaming down the glass in silver rivulets. She pressed her hand against the cool surface, remembering the weight of the baby in her arms, and whispered a quiet prayer to whoever might be listening. Her mother would arrive soon, and the police would want to ask questions. But for now, Sophie remained by the window, her thoughts with the tiny life she discovered and the haunted look in Dr. Chen's eyes. Something told her this was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would change not only her life but the lives of everyone involved in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere beyond the double doors, Dr. Chen was fighting to save a life while confronting ghosts of her own. Sophie settled into one of the hard plastic chairs, prepared to wait for as long as necessary. After all, she thought, you couldn't just walk away after finding something so precious, so fragile, so in need of protection. Thunder rolled in the distance, and Sophie closed her eyes, sending up another silent prayer for the baby, for Dr. Chen, and for whoever had felt desperate enough to leave their child alone in the park on this stormy Saturday afternoon. Dr. Sarah Chen stood motionless in the hospital's dimly lit diagnostic viewing room, staring at the brain MRI images illuminated on the screen before her. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the baby's initial examination and subsequent tests, now trembled slightly as she reached out to trace the telltale lesions on the scan. The symmetrical patterns of light and shadow told a story she knew all too well, one that had haunted her dreams for the past year. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible even in the empty room. "Not again." The bilateral lesions in the basal ganglia were hauntingly familiar. She had spent countless nights studying similar images of her daughter Emma's scans just a year ago. The baby from the park, a little girl approximately 4 months old, showed the characteristic patterns of Lee syndrome, the same rare mitochondrial disease that had taken Emma from her. Sarah's mind drifted back to those endless nights spent in this very room, desperately searching for alternative explanations, for some sign she might have missed, for any hope at all. She clicked through the series of images, each one confirming her fears. The elevated lactate levels from the preliminary blood work, the subtle but distinctive brain stem abnormalities. It was like watching a replay of her worst nightmare. Sarah pulled up Emma's old scans on her secure medical tablet, placing them side by side with the new ones. The similarities were undeniable. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Dr. Chen?" It was Nancy Ramirez, one of the senior PICU nurses who had been there throughout Emma's illness. Nancy had held Sarah when she finally broke down after Emma's passing, and now her presence carried both comfort and concern. "The police are here, and that young girl who brought the baby in her mother's arrived too. They're waiting in the family consultation room." Sarah took a deep breath, straightening her white coat. "Thank you, Nancy. Has social services been notified?" "They're sending someone, but it'll be at least an hour." Storms causing traffic delays. Nancy hesitated, then added softly, "Sarah, I saw the preliminary results. Are you sure you should be handling this case?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah smoothed her coat again, a nervous habit she'd developed during her residency. "I have to, Nancy. I'm the most qualified pediatric neurologist on call, and..." She glanced back at the scans. "And maybe this time I can make a difference." Nancy's expression softened with understanding. She'd been there for every step of Emma's journey, had witnessed Sarah's transformation from confident physician to desperate mother, and finally to a woman trying to rebuild herself from the ashes of loss. "Just remember you're not alone this time either," Nancy said, squeezing Sarah's arm gently before leaving. The walk to the consultation room felt longer than usual. Sarah's mind raced between professional obligation and personal anguish, her thoughts interrupted by fragments of memory, Emma's laugh, the way her dark curls would bounce when she was excited, the final peaceful expression on her face when she slipped away. The baby's condition was critical but stable for now. She had responded well to the initial treatments for her metabolic crisis, but Sarah knew all too well the challenging road ahead. She paused outside the consultation room door, gathering her composure. Through the narrow window, she could see Sophie Bennett perched on the edge of a chair, her legs swinging slightly, a reminder of just how young she was despite her remarkably mature actions today. Beside her sat a woman who shared her dark hair and gentle features, presumably her mother. Two police officers stood near the window, their reflections ghosting against the rain-streaked glass. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. The weight of her stethoscope around her neck, the familiar scratch of her coat's fabric, the distant beeping of monitors, these small sensations helped ground her in her professional role. She could do this. She had to do this. "I'm Dr. Chen," she introduced herself as she entered, managing to keep her voice steady. "I've been treating the infant Sophie brought in." Detective Marcus Rivera stepped forward, notebook in hand. She recognized him from the pediatric unit's annual safety training sessions. He specialized in cases involving children. "Doctor, what can you tell us about the baby's condition?" Sarah glanced at Sophie, noting the girl's wide-eyed concern. She chose her words carefully, conscious of her young audience. "The baby is stable but critical. She's approximately 4 months old and shows signs of a serious underlying medical condition. We're still running tests to confirm the exact diagnosis." The lie of omission felt heavy. She was already certain about the Lee syndrome diagnosis, but announcing it here felt premature without absolute confirmation. More importantly, she knew from bitter experience how devastating that diagnosis could be. Whoever this baby's mother was, she deserved to hear it in a more private setting. "Any signs of abuse?" Detective Rivera's partner, Officer Thompson, asked. She was newer to the force, and her question carried an edge of suspicion that made Sarah bristle internally. "No visible trauma or signs of neglect, apart from being left in the park," Sarah replied, her tone professional but firm. "The baby is well-nourished and was clean before being exposed to the elements. Her weight is appropriate for her age, and there are no signs of chronic neglect." "This?" Sarah paused, choosing her next words carefully. "This feels like an act of desperation rather than malice." Sophie suddenly spoke up, her voice small but clear. "Will she be okay?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. How many times had she asked herself that same question about Emma? How many times had she promised her daughter everything would be fine, even as hope slipped away? She looked at Sophie's earnest face and saw the same desperate need for reassurance she'd once seen in her own reflection. "We're doing everything we can," Sarah replied, the standard medical response falling from her lips automatically. But something in Sophie's expression made her add, "And she has something very special going for her. She was found by someone who cared enough to help." Detective Rivera cleared his throat gently. "Dr. Chen, you mentioned tests. Do you have any preliminary results that might help us understand why the baby was abandoned?" Sarah's hand instinctively went to her coat pocket, where her phone held the preliminary genetic results. "We're still awaiting final confirmation," she said carefully, "but there are indicators of a serious genetic condition." She turned back to the officers. The baby had a medical ID bracelet on her ankle, most likely from previous hospital visits. The name on it reads, Catherine Walsh. Detective Rivera nodded, making notes. "We'll start running the name through our databases. Any identifying marks or notable features we should include in the report." Sarah described the small birthmark behind Catherine's left ear, the slight webbing between her second and third toes, details that might help confirm her identity. As she spoke, she noticed Sophie's mother, whose ID badge identified her as Helen Bennett, RN, watching her with a knowing expression. Of course, Helen would have been working here during Emma's illness. She would know. "I'd like to stay," Sophie announced suddenly. "To visit her, if that's allowed." She looked between her mother and Dr. Chen, her expression hopeful but uncertain. Sarah noticed Helen giving her daughter a thoughtful look. "Sophie, honey, this isn't like the animal shelter. There are protocols." Actually, Sarah found herself saying, surprising even herself, having a familiar presence can be beneficial for infants in the PICU. As long as it's cleared with the nursing staff and doesn't interfere with treatment, supervised visits might be possible. She didn't add that she'd found herself inexplicably drawn to this case, to this strange echo of her own loss. The meeting continued, with details being shared and statements taken. Throughout it all, Sarah watched Sophie, impressed by the girl's mature handling of the situation. There was something special about this 11-year-old who had acted so decisively to save a life. She reminded Sarah of Emma in some ways, not physically, but in that quiet determination, that innate compassion that seemed to radiate from within. Later that evening, after the police and the Bennetts had left, and social services had come and gone, Sarah stood by Catherine Walsh's incubator in the PICU. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, assisted by gentle pressure from the CPAP machine. Her skin had regained some color, but Sarah knew the respite might be temporary. She found herself cataloging the similarities and differences between Catherine and Emma. The same delicate fingers, but different shaped ears. Similar dark lashes, but a different curve to the mouth. "I know what you're facing, little one," she whispered, adjusting the baby's blanket. "I've walked this road before." Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from the lab confirming what she already knew. The genetic tests were positive for Lee syndrome. She closed her eyes, memories washing over her. Emma's diagnosis, the frantic search for treatments, the slow decline, the final peaceful breath in her arms. The countless nights spent researching experimental treatments, the second and third opinions, the hope that dwindled with each passing day. Opening her eyes, Sarah looked down at Catherine. "But maybe this time things can be different. Maybe this time I can help." In the year since Emma's death, there had been new research, new treatment protocols. She'd kept up with every development, even though she no longer had a personal stake in the advances. Until now, she turned to leave, but paused at the door. Through the PICU window, she could see Helen Bennett at the nurse's station, presumably starting her night shift. Their eyes met briefly, and Helen gave her a small nod of understanding. Beyond her, through the unit's large windows, the storm continued to rage. Sarah thought about Sophie, about Catherine, about Emma, about mothers and daughters, and the invisible threads that seemed to be drawing them all together. As if sensing her thoughts, Catherine stirred in her incubator, one tiny hand reaching out into empty air. Sarah walked back and gently slipped her finger into the baby's grasp. "You're not alone," she whispered. "None of us are anymore." The monitors beeped steadily, a rhythmic reminder of both the fragility and persistence of life. Somewhere in the city, Sarah knew, Catherine's mother was out there, perhaps wrestling with impossible decisions, carrying burdens Sarah understood all too well. The police would find her eventually. They always did in cases like this. But what would happen then? Sarah squeezed her eyes shut against sudden tears. When she opened them again, her decision was made. Whatever happened next, she would be there not just as a doctor, but as someone who understood the crushing weight of watching a child battle this merciless disease. She owed that much to Emma's memory, to Catherine's future, and to the brave girl who had refused to walk past a bush without investigating a cry for help. The storm outside began to ease, but Sarah knew their own storm was just beginning. She pulled out her phone and began composing an email to Dr. Marcus at Johns Hopkins. He'd been working on a new treatment protocol for Lee syndrome. It was time to call in every favor, explore every option. This time, she would fight not just with a mother's desperation, but with the weight of experience and the power of hope that sometimes came from the most unexpected places. From down the hall, she heard Sophie's voice, apparently. She convinced her mother to let her stop by before heading home. Sarah smiled slightly, reminded that sometimes the biggest changes came from the smallest acts of kindness. She tucked her phone away and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that this time, at least, none of them would have to face them alone. 5 days after Catherine's discovery in the park, Jessica Walsh stood in the shadows of St. Mary's Hospital's chapel, her fingers tracing the worn wooden pews. The evening news had shown her baby's picture, along with a plea for the mother to come forward. She hadn't slept since seeing it, her mind tormented by images of her daughter alone in a hospital bed, surrounded by strangers. The chapel's stained glass windows cast muted rainbow patterns across the floor, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Jessica's heart. At 26, she had never imagined herself here, a single mother, drowning in medical bills, who had committed the unthinkable act of abandoning her child. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. "I thought I might find you here." Jessica spun around to find Dr. Sarah Chen standing in the doorway. Her heart nearly stopped. "How did you?" "Security cameras caught you watching the PICU from the parking lot last night," Sarah said quietly, letting the chapel door close behind her. "You have your mother's eyes." I recognized them from Catherine's face. Jessica's legs gave way, and she sank into the nearest pew. "Are you going to call the police?" Sarah moved further into the chapel but maintained a respectful distance. "That depends on our conversation." She paused, then added, "I know about the Lee syndrome diagnosis from Boston Children's Hospital." "Then you know why I did it," Jessica whispered, tears beginning to fall. "The experimental treatments they suggested. Even with insurance, I can't." She broke off, shoulders shaking. Sarah sat down in the pew across the aisle. "I know exactly what you're going through, Jessica. My daughter Emma had Lee syndrome too. She passed away last year." The confession hung in the air between them. Jessica looked up, really seeing the doctor for the first time. The shadows under her eyes, the grief etched in fine lines around her mouth, the understanding in her gaze. "Did she suffer?" Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I made sure of that. But I also made sure we tried everything possible first." She took a deep breath. "There are new treatments being developed, Jessica. Things that weren't available when Emma was sick. Dr. Marcus at Johns Hopkins." "Stop," Jessica interrupted, standing abruptly. "Please just stop. I know about the new treatments. I spent months researching, hoping, praying. But do you know what they cost? Do you know what it's like to choose between paying for treatments that might not even work and keeping a roof over your child's head?" Sarah stood as well, her voice taking on an edge of urgency. "There are programs, grants. I've applied to them all." Jessica's voice echoed off the chapel walls. "I've begged, borrowed, sold everything of value I own. I worked 3 jobs until I couldn't stay awake long enough to care for my own baby. And still, it wasn't enough. It will never be enough." At that moment, the chapel door opened again. Sophie Bennett stepped in, then froze at the sight of the 2 women. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I come here sometimes to pray for Catherine." Jessica stared at the girl, recognition dawning. "You're the one who found her." Sophie nodded, clutching a small stuffed rabbit, one she'd brought for Catherine but hadn't yet had the courage to leave. "She's getting stronger," she offered tentatively. "I visit her every day after school. She likes when people read to her, and she holds onto your finger really tight, like she never wants to let go." The simple observation broke something in Jessica. She collapsed back onto the pew, sobs racking her body. Sophie moved instinctively toward her, but Sarah held up a hand, stopping her. "Sophie, honey, could you give us a moment?" But Jessica looked up, wiping her eyes. "No, please. Let her stay. I need to know everything about Catherine. These past 5 days." Not knowing, Sophie approached cautiously, sitting beside Jessica. With the natural compassion that had led her to check that bush in the park, she began to talk about Catherine, how the nurses had discovered she loved classical music, how she seemed to smile in her sleep, how her favorite time of day was sunset when the light turned golden through the PICU windows. Sarah watched the interaction, her medical training warring with her personal experience. She knew she should call security, alert the authorities. But she also knew that sometimes healing required breaking away from standard protocols. "Jessica," she said finally, "I have a proposal for you. But first, I need you to understand something." She moved to sit on Jessica's other side. "What you did in the park, leaving Catherine there, that can never happen again. But the desperation that drove you to that point, I understand it. Many people will judge you, but I won't be one of them." Jessica tensed. "What's your proposal?" "There's a new trial starting at Johns Hopkins. I've already spoken with Dr. Marcus about Catherine's case. He's willing to include her, and I found a foundation willing to cover the associated costs." Sarah paused, letting this sink in. But they need her legal guardian's consent. They need you to come back officially, to face what happened and move forward. They'll arrest me, Jessica whispered. Probably, Sarah acknowledged. But I'll testify on your behalf. Explain the circumstances, the impossible choice you faced. And while the legal issues are being resolved, Catherine will be receiving treatment. She'll have a fighting chance. Sophie, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. My mom says sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit when we've made a mistake and try to fix it. Jessica looked at the girl, then at Sarah. Why would you help me like this? After what I did? Because a year ago, I couldn't save my daughter. But maybe together we can save yours. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a business card. This is the number for Andrea Morton. She's a lawyer who specializes in cases like yours, and she's willing to take your case pro bono. All you have to do is call. The chapel fell silent except for the distant sound of hospital equipment and footsteps in the corridor outside. Jessica stared at the card in Sarah's hand. Her whole world balanced on this single moment of choice. Suddenly, alarms began blaring from the PICU. Sarah's pager went off simultaneously. She glanced at it, her face paling. It's Catherine. She's having a crisis. Jessica stood immediately, maternal instinct overriding everything else. I need to see her. Please. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Follow me. Both of you. They rushed from the chapel, through corridors that seemed endless. When they reached the PICU, they found a team of medical professionals surrounding Catherine's incubator. Jessica pressed her hands against the observation window, watching in horror as her daughter's tiny body convulsed. Dr. Chen, Nancy called out as Sarah entered the unit. BP's dropping, lactate levels are spiking. Sarah snapped into doctor mode, her voice calm and authoritative as she began issuing orders. But even as she worked, she was aware of Jessica's presence behind the glass, of Sophie standing beside her, offering silent support. Minutes stretched like hours until finally, Catherine's vitals stabilized. Sarah stepped back, allowing the other staff to continue their monitoring. She walked to the observation window, where Jessica stood trembling. She's stable now, Sarah assured her. But this is why we need to act quickly. The trial at Johns Hopkins. I'll call the lawyer, Jessica interrupted, her eyes never leaving her daughter. I'll do whatever it takes. Just, please don't let my baby die. Sarah placed a hand on the window, her palm aligned with Jessica's. We're going to fight this together. All of us. She glanced at Sophie, who nodded firmly. I'll stay with her, Sophie promised. Every day. Until you can be here yourself. Jessica turned to the young girl, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. For everything. For finding her. For caring for her. For being here now. Through the window, they watched as Catherine's eyes fluttered open. Her tiny hand reached out, grasping at air, just as she had done that first day. But this time, her mother was there to see it. Go to the lawyer's office, Sarah said softly. I'll stay with Catherine until you return. And Jessica? She waited until the young mother met her eyes. Emma taught me that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the most courage. What you're doing now, facing this head-on, that's real love. Jessica squared her shoulders, drawing strength from Sarah's words and Sophie's presence. She took one last look at her daughter, then turned toward the elevators. Each step felt like both an ending and a beginning. Behind her, Sarah and Sophie remained at the window, watching Catherine drift back to sleep. The setting sun painted the PICU in shades of gold, just as Sophie had described, casting long shadows that seemed to connect all of them, doctor, child, and baby, in a web of fate and choice and hope. The storm that had brought them together had passed, but its echoes would ripple through their lives forever. In its wake, they had found something unexpected. A chance for redemption, a path to healing, and most importantly, the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, none of them had to face the darkness alone. Sarah's pager beeped again, Dr. Marcus from Johns Hopkins, responding to her earlier message. She looked at Catherine, peaceful now in her incubator, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Emma's death. Hope. Real, tangible hope. Sometimes, she murmured, more to herself than to Sophie. The hardest storms bring us exactly where we need to be. Sophie slipped her small hand into Sarah's. And sometimes, she added wisely, they teach us how to dance in the rain. Together, they watched the sun set on this day of revelations and new beginnings, knowing that while the path ahead would not be easy, they would walk it together, stronger for having found each other in the storm. 3 weeks after the chapel confrontation, Sarah sat in the witness box of courtroom 312 at the Millbrook County Courthouse. Through the tall windows, autumn sunlight streamed in, highlighting the dancing dust motes in the air. She kept her voice steady as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, as Catherine Walsh's treating physician, I can attest that Jessica Walsh's decision to leave her daughter in the park, while deeply misguided, came from a place of profound desperation rather than malicious intent. The financial and emotional burden of caring for a child with Lee syndrome can be overwhelming. I know this not just as a doctor, but as a mother who lost her own daughter to this same condition. Judge Marion Reeves, a woman with silver-streaked hair and keen eyes, leaned forward. Dr. Chen, you've gone to considerable lengths to advocate for Ms. Walsh. You arranged for her legal representation, secured a place in an experimental treatment program, and even established a foundation to assist with medical costs. Why invest yourself so personally in this case? Sarah met the judge's gaze unflinchingly. Because I understand that sometimes good people make desperate choices when they feel they have no options left. Ms. Walsh didn't abandon her daughter. She left her in a public place where she knew Catherine would be found quickly. She chose a location near a hospital. These weren't the actions of someone who didn't care. They were the actions of someone who cared so much that she believed giving up her child was the only way to save her. In the gallery, Sophie Bennett sat between her mother and Detective Rivera, who had also testified about the circumstances of the case. Sophie clutched her mother's hand as she watched Jessica Walsh, seated at the defense table in a borrowed navy blue suit, her shoulders rigid with tension. Furthermore, Sarah continued, Ms. Walsh has demonstrated genuine remorse and a fierce determination to make things right. She voluntarily surrendered herself to authorities, has complied with all court requirements, and has not missed a single treatment session or medical consultation regarding Catherine's care. Despite having to be accompanied by officers each time, the judge nodded thoughtfully, making notes before addressing Jessica directly. Ms. Walsh, please stand. Jessica rose slowly, her lawyer's hand supportive at her elbow. Ms. Walsh, this court has carefully considered the unique circumstances of your case. While child abandonment is a serious offense, we must also consider intent and context. Dr. Chen's testimony, along with the statements from Detective Rivera and the clinical social workers, paint a picture of a mother driven to desperate measures by an impossible situation. The judge paused, removing her reading glasses. However, actions must have consequences, even when they come from a place of desperation. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 2 years of probation, mandatory parenting and financial management classes, and 200 hours of community service, which may be served by assisting Dr. Chen's newly established foundation for families affected by rare genetic disorders. Relief flooded Jessica's face as the judge continued. Additionally, you will maintain regular meetings with a court-appointed social worker and continue participating in the counseling program you've already begun. Custody of Catherine will be restored to you, with monthly monitoring by social services for the duration of your probation. Judge Reeves's expression softened slightly. Ms. Walsh, you have been given a second chance. I trust you will make the most of it. Thank you, Your Honor, Jessica whispered, tears streaming down her face. I will. After the proceedings concluded, they gathered in the courthouse corridor. Sarah, Jessica, Sophie and her mother, Detective Rivera, and Andrea Morton, Jessica's lawyer. The morning sunlight through the high windows caught the tears on Jessica's cheeks, making them glitter like diamonds. I don't know how to thank you all, Jessica began, but Sarah shook her head. There's no need, she said firmly. What matters now is moving forward. The Hopkins trial begins next week, and Catherine's showing promising responses to the preliminary treatments. Sophie stepped forward, holding out a small photo album. I made this for you, she told Jessica shyly. It's pictures of Catherine from when you couldn't be there. so you won't miss anything." Jessica knelt down to Sophie's level, accepting the album with trembling hands. As she flipped through the pages, each one documented with Sophie's careful handwriting, noting dates and small milestones. Fresh tears spilled over. "You kept her story alive," Jessica whispered. "When I was too afraid to face it myself, you made sure she wasn't alone." Detective Rivera cleared his throat. "Speaking of moving forward, I've spoken with the hospital administration. They've agreed to let Ms. Walsh resume her job in the billing department, with some additional training in insurance advocacy. The skills could be valuable for the foundation's work." Sarah nodded, remembering their discussions about turning painful experience into purposeful action. The foundation, hastily established in those tense days after the chapel confrontation, was already helping 3 other families navigate the complicated landscape of rare disease treatment. Helen Bennett spoke up. "And you'll have support. We've established a network of volunteer nurses to help with Catherine's care when you're working or taking classes. No one should have to face this alone." Jessica stood, clutching Sophie's photo album to her chest. "I still don't understand why you've all done so much for us. After what I did." "Because that's what community means," Sophie said simply, with the straightforward wisdom of children. "Helping each other through the hard parts." Sarah watched the interaction, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that appeared whenever she thought of Emma. But now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose, of healing through helping others. She thought of the empty room in her house that she was converting into a foundation office, of the support group meetings she would begin hosting next month, of the research papers on her desk detailing promising new treatments. "Catherine's afternoon treatment session is in an hour," Sarah reminded them gently. "Why don't we head back to the hospital?" "Sophie, I believe you mentioned something about finishing Charlotte's Web today." They moved as a group toward the courthouse exits, their footsteps echoing in the marble corridor. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings. Jessica paused at the top of the courthouse steps, lifting her face to the sun. "It's strange," she said quietly to Sarah. "A month ago, I felt so alone that I made the worst decision of my life. Now I have more support than I ever imagined possible." Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "Emma taught me that sometimes the greatest gifts come from our deepest wounds. What matters is what we choose to do with them." As they descended the steps together, Sarah reflected on the chain of events that had brought them all together: a child's compassion, a mother's desperation, a doctor's grief, and the healing power of understanding. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest storms really did bring us exactly where we needed to be. Later, in Catherine's hospital room, as Sophie's clear voice read about Charlotte's Web and friendship's transformative power, Sarah watched Jessica hold her daughter's hand and knew that while the road ahead would not be easy, none of them would walk it alone again. And sometimes that made all the difference. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Sophie Bennett stood once again in Riverside Park. The rhododendron bush where she had found Catherine was now adorned with a small bronze plaque. "Hope begins with a single act of kindness. The Catherine Walsh Foundation supporting families affected by rare genetic disorders." The morning sun caught the polished surface of the plaque, making it gleam against the dark green leaves. Sophie traced the letters with her finger, remembering that stormy September day that had changed so many lives. "I thought I'd find you here." Sophie turned to see Dr. Chen approaching, carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the cafe across the street. She handed one to Sophie with a smile. "Mom said you'd taken a detour on your way to the hospital," Sarah continued, settling beside Sophie on the wooden bench that had been installed alongside the plaque. "Big day today." Sophie nodded, warming her hands around the cup. "Do you think Catherine will understand what's happening?" "She might be too young to understand the specifics, but she'll feel the love in that room. That's what matters." Sarah paused, watching a pair of sparrows hop along the pathway. "The latest test results came back yesterday, by the way. The new treatment protocol is showing promising results." Sophie's face lit up. "Really? Her lactate levels are stabilizing, and the most recent MRI showed no progression of the lesions. Dr. Marcus is cautiously optimistic." Sarah took a sip of her own hot chocolate. "Of course, we still have a long road ahead. But But she has a chance now, Sophie finished. And she's not alone. The words hung in the morning air, carrying the weight of all that had happened since that September afternoon. The foundation, initially created to help with Catherine's medical expenses, had grown to support dozens of families across the state. The support group that met in the hospital's community room every Thursday was consistently full, with parents sharing resources, advice, and hope. Sarah checked her watch. We should head over. Jessica will be waiting. They walked together through the park, now bursting with spring blooms. As they approached St. Mary's Hospital, they could see balloons tied to the entrance of the pediatric wing, pale yellow and mint green, dancing in the breeze. Inside, the hospital's small chapel had been transformed. Flowers filled every available surface, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. Jessica stood at the front, Catherine in her arms, both dressed in matching white dresses. The baby, now 10 months old, was alert and curious, her dark eyes taking in the gathered crowd. Helen Bennett was there, along with Detective Rivera and his family. Nancy Ramirez stood with a group of PICU nurses, all of them beaming. Dr. Marcus had flown in from Johns Hopkins for the occasion. Even Judge Reeves sat in one of the back pews, her usual stern expression softened by the atmosphere of joy. As Sophie and Sarah slipped into their places, Jessica stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, her voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I stood in this chapel believing I had lost everything. Today, we're here to celebrate not just Catherine's baptism, but the miracle of community and second chances. She looked down at her daughter, who reached up to pat her cheek. This journey has taught me that sometimes our darkest moments can lead us to our greatest light. Each of you here today has been part of that light. Jessica turned to Sophie. Sophie, would you and Dr. Chen please come forward? They approached the front of the chapel as Jessica continued. Today, I'm asking you both to be Catherine's godmothers. Not just because you saved her life, but because you showed me what it means to never give up hope. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Catherine, so full of life and possibility. She thought of Emma, as she did every day, but now the memory brought more comfort than pain. Somehow, helping Catherine and Jessica had begun to heal wounds she'd thought would never close. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the priest asked who would help guide Catherine through life, the entire chapel responded, "We will." It wasn't just a ritual response, it was a promise from a community that had come together in extraordinary circumstances and refused to let go. Afterward, as sunshine streamed through the stained glass windows and well-wishers mingled over cake and coffee, Sophie found herself back at the observation window where she'd spent so many hours watching over Catherine. Sarah joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sophie smiled. "I was just thinking about that day in the park. I almost walked past that bush, you know? It was starting to rain, and I was supposed to head straight home. But you didn't walk past," Sarah said softly. "You stopped. You listened. You cared. That's what you did too," Sophie pointed out. "With Jessica, you could have just called the police that night in the chapel, but you listened instead." Sarah watched as Jessica moved through the crowd, Catherine secure in her arms, both of them surrounded by love and support. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. A girl who stops to check a bush, a doctor who chooses understanding over judgment, a mother who finds the courage to come back and try again. Sophie leaned against Sarah's side. "Do you think Emma would be proud of everything you've done with the foundation?" Sarah felt her breath catch at the question, but her answer came from a place of deep certainty. "I think Emma taught me how to love beyond limits. Everything since then has been about sharing that lesson." Across the room, Catherine let out a peal of laughter as someone played peekaboo with her. The sound echoed off the chapel walls, pure and joyful and full of promise. "Dr. Chen?" Sophie asked after a moment. "Do you think we could add something to that plaque in the park? What did you have in mind? Maybe underneath it could say, 'Every storm has its rainbow.'" Sarah smiled, remembering rain-streaked windows and desperate prayers, sleepless nights and small victories, and the countless ways love could transform grief into purpose. "I think that's perfect, Sophie. absolutely perfect. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah and Sophie remained by the window, watching spring clouds drift across the sky. Below the hospital, the garden where Sarah had spent so many difficult nights during Emma's illness was bursting with new growth. Daffodils and crocuses pushing through the soil, reaching for the light. Life, Sarah reflected, was like that sometimes. Even in the hardest ground, hope found a way to bloom. All it needed was someone willing to plant the seeds, to nurture the possibilities, to believe in the promise of tomorrow. Catherine's laugh rang out again, and this time, everyone in the chapel laughed with her, the pure, joyful sound of love multiplied, of storms weathered together, of darkness transformed into light. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had all built together, Sarah knew that while some storms changed you forever, it was what you built in their aftermath that truly defined you. Sometimes, it took a child's wisdom to show you the way home, a baby's cry to wake you from grief, a desperate mother's courage to remind you of love's boundless capacity to heal. The light through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across the chapel floor, and Sarah thought that Sophie was right. Every storm did have its rainbow. You just had to be brave enough to keep looking up, to keep believing, to keep reaching out your hand to others caught in the rain. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found yourself exactly where you needed to be, surrounded by love, strengthened by purpose, and forever changed by the simple, profound truth that hope begins with a single act of kindness.